This is an interview with David Mertz, senior developer, data scientist, and author. David recently published Regular Expression Puzzles and AI Coding Assistants, which we'll talk about in this podcast. He got his PhD in 1999 in political philosophy before switching field into machine learning and development. He is also on the board of directors of the Python Software Foundation and does a lot of other stuff. In this interview, we go over a lot of different issues related to generative AI, including legal issues, but also copyrights, attribution, and moral rights. I hope you enjoy this interview. So I'd love if you could introduce yourself and give your background.
Yeah, thank you, Louis. My name is David Mertz, and I've done a number of different things in my career, in my life, but in particular, sort of latest, I do some work in training and writing books and actually doing code in areas of machine learning. Um, Particularly, that comes out of when I formerly worked at Anaconda, which is something of a player in the Python space and machine learning stuff. Since then, I've gone on to do a variety of other things. I actually have a background that's very different from that, like decades ago, but I got a doctorate in political philosophy. And so naturally, after many years completing a doctorate, I discovered that you don't actually get paid to have a doctorate in philosophy. So writing computer programs.
And did you transition from political philosophy to coding mainly because of basically the money, or did you always have an interest in coding and such like machine learning models and things like that?
There was a lot of practicality about it, but nonetheless, I had, of course, been programming since I was a teenager. My junior high school had access to the mainframe that was across town and writing Fortran and things like that. That's what it was in the '80s or something.
Hmm.
Um, and also some of my background was in mathematics. I did a bit of mostly very pure math, set theory, and a little bit of model theory or logic or things like that.
Was the transition difficult from such a different field?
Oh, it really wasn't. And, actually, this is more life advice possibly to your listeners, but like many of the people who are really strongest and the most wonderful to work with in sort of software development, technical, uh, machine learning areas are actually people who have come out of entirely different domains, and people like in humanities or music or other things. Obviously, there's things that you learn in education programs that are going to be relevant to what you do in that area. But people who have, as I hope I do, very uh, engaged and open and minds and a willingness to learn can, it's not a particularly difficult transition, actually.
Yeah, especially with everything available online right now, it's like
Yeah.
easier than ever to learn something new and practice and improve. So you mentioned that you recently wrote a book, and I believe it is related to generative AI. And so I'd love if you could maybe give us a brief overview of what is the book about, more a bit more precisely. And also I'd love if you could maybe start with what is generative AI to you.
Sure. So let me say first, I did this book on Manning. I don't know if it's useful to hold it up, but there's what it looks like, and folks can go buy it from Manning. But it was this kind of a puzzles about regular expressions, where I would give these sort of edge cases or complicated things that would allow you to think about, in sometimes the weird theoretical edge cases of understanding what they're really capable of doing, and hopefully that's a way of for developers to gain skills in that particular mini language that's embedded in most every other programming language. Um, and in the first sort of iteration of this, it was my own discussion of what the solutions were, or in some cases that it was impossible to solve this problem using that
Mm.
technique. And I was approached by Manning at late last year in the end of 2022. And through the discussion, we decided to do a sort of enhancement or an update to that book that was just about regular expressions that would look at how effective these new tools, these AI coding assistants like Copilot and ChatGPT had just come out, and there'll be more in the future. There's one called Tab9 I used a couple years ago that's still around. That's a similar kind of concept. But many developers will be familiar with these. Either you've read about them or you actually use them, where you're in some sort of coding development environment and there is artificial intelligence or a large language model behind the scenes that makes suggestions for how you might complete your code, whether it's, fleshing out the full function from the function signature or giving a comment in the code and it will try to write code that matches your comment. In some cases, the reverse way where it'll compose the comments from the actual structure of the code that exists. A variety of things. And it's sometimes quite impressive what these tools can do. In some cases, like Copilot, they're integrated into the editors you might be using anyway. In others, like ChatGPT, it's you go to a separate interface, which is sort of modeled on a chat client, like you might talk with your friends in, but it's talking to the AI. But in either case, it'll provide these possible answers to what we software developers actually do. And I thought that this case with the regular expressions that I had written the earlier book on was a nice test case because regular expressions are so compact and so interdependent. Of course, it doesn't matter about the specific token length that's involved if one character or word based or a byte pair encoded or something like that. Really, in terms of the complexity, but the kind of deep interdependence in regular expressions is definitely challenging for these language models. And I took a look at how Copilot and ChatGPT in particular, in the future, there'll be other tools that'll be similar and equally relevant to evaluate. And it's interesting to look not only where they produce really good and interesting results, but more often where they dramatically fail too, and trying to understand the mind of the machine and what are sort of the modes of these failures. So I have some discussion about that and some kind of advice to programmers, developers about how actually to utilize these assistants. So I don't know exactly the machine that is underneath Copilot or that's underneath ChatGPT or GPT-4 that just came out, but I have some feelings about what's going on. The general idea is it uses a system called transformers, which is a kind of neural network architecture. In particular, it allows something called an attention mechanism and a self-attention mechanism, where you can look at the not just the last few symbols like you might get in a kind of machine called a recurrent neural network, but rather a very large number, perhaps like thousands of previous tokens, and contextually give more weight to prior tokens, perhaps quite a ways before the current production that's involved in the current output of this model. And that turns out to be very effective in making these, sort of magical chatbots and code assistants and things like that.
Could you share some interesting insights and limitations that you've seen using ChatGPT and Copilot during this work, or basically share some of the insights from your books, from your book?
There's certainly a big tendency, and this I found even of not just the regular expression examples, which I think push at the boundaries, but even in regular code. And I can even say something of the same thing of just sort of general prose text. You ask these machines, some of them, questions about sort of general conversational knowledge, like you would talk with a human. And this issue of hallucination is extremely prominent, where you imagine you're having a conversation as if with a human, and the AI will very freely just make up entirely nonsense facts to put into there because they are the kinds of words, the kind of tokens that typically occur in that context within the corpus that it was trained on. But but they're not actually true. There's no sort of epistemic basis that these machines can utilize. It's just simply not how they work. And that's a thing I think in the popular press and for many users of these is a misunderstanding. That's simply not a concern. What they're trying to do is they're trying to produce the most typical expected completions from given prompts or from given prior text. Well, when it comes to programming, that means you see lots of stuff that looks like valid syntactic code, but it doesn't actually do conceptually the thing that you're interested in. But the ways that it fails to do that can be quite subtle. You have to actually know what the code is supposed to be and actually know the constructs of the particular language or mini language,
Mm.
like with regular expressions, that you're interested in, and to understand where it's gone amiss. I mean, it looks in both cases, both the sort of natural language prose and in the programming language prose, in a sense, the symbols that make that up, something that's superficially very plausible. And that's pretty consistent in the state of the machines now, where, if you're not paying a lot of attention and you don't really think through or research what is actually true and what's not, or what is actually, functional, relative to your particular program that you're trying to develop, um, it looks like the right thing. So it can be very easy and tempting to just assume that it's doing the right thing because the errors are not.
Would you say that experience is with uh, c- your main experience with generative AI is with coding, or have you also tried it a lot with writing?
I've tried it a little bit with writing, but many of the same kind of toy cases that, everyone else who's subscribed to one of these things has done. I've asked it to write, a biography of myself or of my friends or of, famous people or things like that, or, a little bit of, like a historical question or something like that. And it gives answers that, as I said, are kind of the most typical things one would say about that topic. So if I ask, or if users do, if your listeners do, ask about, a biography of me, well, I'm someone who's published, who's done some things that have been described in the corpora that go into the training of these models. And so therefore it'll pick up on certain elements of that. Like it probably knows I was director of the Python Software Foundation, one of several directors at a given term. Um, and so, that's something that probably occurs in proximity to my name relatively often within the corpora that are in the training data.
Mm.
So, okay, it finds that true fact, but not because of the truthfulness of it, just simply because of the proximity and attention relations of the different parts of it that occur in the training sets. Um, and similarly, if you ask it but just to continue that, but it also makes up lots of things that, if you didn't know me very well, could be true. The sort of things you say
Yeah.
about people who have done the sorts of things I've done. Like I went to university and grad school, but completely different ones than I actually went to because it's plausible. It could be true. I could have gone to those other ones.
Yeah.
And it's much the same if you ask it, a history question. Mostly it just sort of spits back the, high school level answer to, what one typically says about that historical question. So it's probably not wrong because a lot of people have said relatively inane but relatively similar things about this historical issue. But if, and this is equally true of the code, if it doesn't know, a sort of most typical pattern that is actually has some sort of verisimilitude to it, it will just make up words that sort of make sense in the context.
Mm. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And for writing, is pretty clear on how it can basically help spread misinformation, just because it will hallucinate false statements, as you just mentioned. But it's a bit less clear to me how it can impact the code generation, in the sense that it can definitely just produce bad code examples that cannot be used. But what could be dangerous of using such an AI coding assistant?
Well, I mean, in the example of regular expressions, which are, the subject of my book and are something that are notoriously subtle, it's very easy to create a pattern that you think, I mean, even as a human being, you think is going to match the particular, pattern in the text that you hope to, identify and pull out or modify or whatever. You, as a human, it's very easy to write something that will get many of the cases correct, but
Mm.
miss edge cases. And using the code assistance is just sort of an amplification of that kind of error that humans make. Um, it'll very often get a little bit right. It'll catch some of the cases that are at issue, especially if you give a relatively clear prompt of what you're trying to do. But it'll miss many edge cases, even if you know, they actually are logically implied by the description or the prompt that you're using to produce it. So they'll do something that's right, but it doesn't actually capture the underlying logic or the underlying intention.
And where would you draw the line between code that is AI generated or code that just is used a human that is just using an AI to help produce the code? Like where can we say that it is AI generated or it's just human but with some help, just as if I would ask on Stack Overflow to help me code? Like where is the line where it's officially AI generated code?
Whether the AI is the author or is AI created, I mean, it's an assistant. It's providing a possible suggestion for what I might want to occur in my code, and I have to make the decision to accept it. Um, I mean, I certainly should. There may be lazy programmers or not as good programmers who will too automatically accept it,
Yeah.
and the code quality will suffer as a consequence. Um, of course, people write bad code all on their own too, so it's not unique to the AIs. But I don't really think that there's such an issue about, like giving credit to a machine or um, like it's important. Even I don't think even from an auditing or security or regulatory perspective, it's even necessarily important to say this was written by a human versus written by an AI. It's code that's going to do something.
Yeah.
And obviously, there's a human driving it in some way, but how much is done for them is not entirely relevant.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And would you say that since it's becoming more and more powerful, but it's based on probabilities and statistics of existing code, would you say that it may hurt the innovation of our coding? Like we may more people may rely on this tool and not produce some sort of better programming than before, like may limit the innovation towards the different programming.
Oh, that's definitely a danger of code quality suffering as a consequence of too much use of these things. And there is an inherent tendency to produce the most mediocre response possible. I mean, by definition, you're trying to produce the most typical completion
Yeah.
of, a given prior sequence of tokens, and the most typical one is going to be, in some way, the most mediocre one. Nothing can ever
Yeah,
like
easier.
stand out. But that's more probably a question of like human prose. If I'm, reading a Borges novel or a short story, he has a very characteristic writing style, and it has a feel and has originality and has unexpected. I mean, I've read it in the translations, not in the Spanish, um, but whatever. I could pick a English language writer as well. But there's something very distinctive about it, and you're never going to get that kind of distinctiveness for prose or poetry or something like that from the machines. Although unless you're an expert and a connoisseur of the kinds of writing, you may not notice that difference. But with code, I'm not sure that that focus on originality is really the same. I mean, I've definitely seen code that I think is beautiful code, but you very, very quickly get into, as soon as it's too original, it's probably too clever, and it's not something that people can easily understand and easily reuse, even if it actually does the right thing in an interesting and creative way. Like, you actually don't want code to be creative.
Yeah, definitely. And do you foresee any other limitations of using generative AI, of using coding assistants, AI coding assistants, other than innovation and trying to, as we said, it will surely use the easier way of programming a function, or like the most common type. But what
Well,
would
I do
be
think,
another limitation of it?
I mean, I do think there's an issue here from a sort of social or ethical perspective that I'm going to sort of transition in our conversation towards, which I think is interesting, is that there is a certain question of authenticity. One can imagine using assistants to, fake your school papers, or fake your, not fake, but, produce um, political speeches, or
Mm,
newspaper articles, or other kinds of things, where there is a sort of reputational stake in a social basis for a reputational stake in your actual production of a particular text. And these machines might make it easy to not do that. I mean, you think particularly in an education context, you really want a responsibility for students to do their own work, not plagiarize in a sense. I'm not. It's not
yeah,
literally plagiarism, because there's not a author with a copyright stake in the same way, but plagiarism is actually broader than that. It's you it's a requirement for originality. If my old field of doing political philosophy, if I could take an author from hundreds of years ago who wrote very interesting philosophical thoughts, of course it's not under copyright, so it's not like I, in any event, would owe a payment to them for quoting them. But nonetheless, if I'm claiming this is my original thought, it should be my original words that do it. Um, so, in some sense, if I'm quoting the AI without attribution, then it's the same kind of issue. And I do think for this, and this is a thing I think is interesting to talk about, is there is technically a pretty good approach to authenticating, or watermarking um, AI productions. It depends a little bit on the kind of productions. Some of the things that we generate, we haven't really talked about it as much in this conversation, but it was very popular just a few months ago, or maybe on the order of a year, where people would use these image generator programs
mm,
that you type in a few words of a prompt, and it'll do a interesting picture that's generated from that description, and it's sort of humorously amazing how you write just a few words, and they can be very fanciful and kind of incongruous words together, and it will make some sort of picture that really does seem to be a representation of that particular phrase that you've come up with. And that's fun to look at. I'm not sure what actual social value it has, but I mean,
yeah,
people play games and so on too, so it's that not everything has to have a sort of productive social value in that sense. But in that case, the watermarking question, that is, we might want to say of a given output, a given production, whether this was in fact generated by an AI or whether it was created by a human. For the image issue, it's actually pretty well understood and pretty easy. Um, when you have a photographic kind of image, something with continuous tones in it, uh, no, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a photograph. It can be a you know digital composition,
yeah.
art program or something like that as well. But something that emphasizes continuous tones, human eyes don't perceive very small.
You gave the example for for education, obviously, for not plagiarizing, but using something else to do your homework and etc. So that's definitely a problem for education. But is other than education? Well, first, other than education, is this a real problem? And second, regarding to education, how do you think this will affect our current education system?
Um, I think in the short term, I mean, these uh, potential laws that I don't exist that I'm discussing how they might conceptually work certainly aren't going to be in place, this year or even
Mm,
next year. I mean, maybe they will be at some point in the future, but laws don't move quickly typically. Um, so, I mean, I do think we're going to see a whole lot of cases where students everywhere from, elementary school to grad school, start writing papers or, uh, you know, school papers or professional papers, or like things like journalists producing articles that aren't really written by them,
mm,
which I do think raises some social concerns. Um, and it's not going to be very easy to detect that fact for currently. And even though there are many, many cases where it's not really socially important to have this attribution to the generative AI, there are enough cases where one should, admit to that. One should document that that was the approach used. That I actually think it's kind of a good idea to pass laws along this line.
mm.
Um, you know, Education isn't the only thing that people write text about, but it's one, and it's an important one. It has a significant social function, and
Definitely.
you know you couldn't have a switch that's watermark it now because I'm a student. You would have to do it systematically, otherwise students would turn off the switch and not do that.
So how do you think this will, well, this new trend of using generative AI will affect copyrights? And also another question after that is that how is it different from other new technologies such as printing and other stuff that allowed us to scale writing basically? How is this copywriting issue different from then to now with using AI?
There's a concern that's been expressed by many people I know, and I'm sure that many people that the listeners know, of creators, particularly visual artists, but to some degree, like authors, people who write prose, where they feel like the productions of these uh, artificial intelligence, which I don't really like to say artificial intelligence because it suggests a generality that I think is not yet where we are, but these machine learning models that produce particular outputs that have, perhaps useful value or cultural significance or things like that, that they are derived in some sense from human produced works. Whether I know someone who's a visual artist and has done paintings and drawings and things like that, and those were used in the training data for these various machines
Mm,
that images as outputs, and they're not getting any royalties from a copyright perspective, and they're also not even getting any attribution credit.
yeah.
It's a similar concept if you are talking about writing, where the particular kinds of words that I choose to use in my writing, or the particular style of grammatical and linguistic composition of words that I characteristically have in my writing, can be mimicked in some sense by the machine, and I don't get any credit for that. There's a sort of academic tradition of giving credit where credit's due. And the feeling of many people is that these machines are taking that content without giving this credit that is merited. And for some of them, of my acquaintance and whom I see in general discourse, articles and op-eds and things like that, it's people who, are alive and actually make money, make their living from doing these creative works.
Yeah.
And the AIs mimic these creative works, and they feel that it's undercutting their ability to do it, the market for their productions, and they feel that there's something unjust in that. Um, so I think it's interesting to consider. I'm not sure where I actually would come down, or how I feel about the copyright issue. I think that's sort of much less plausible in my mind, that you know uh, OpenAI makes a machine and it produced some text and it should send me a thousandth of a penny royalty check for having based that text on the thing that I created before. Um, but certainly in an attribution sense. And in this case, it's much more work to actually do this than it is for the watermarking question. I've had some thoughts about approaches that might be possible to, stipulating there was laws being written, and these were actually enforced on the producers of the generative AI. Um, how would they assign this attribution? And it's not necessarily easy. I mean, it's not necessarily easy in the sense of computational resources in particular. So when you have any kind of neural network, and honestly, you probably understand this better than I do. I understand you're doing your doctorate in neural networks specifically, but there's always this is true of convolutional networks. This is true of transformers. This is true of any architecture. In neural networks, you have some sort of feed-forward step, and the particular arrangement of neurons can be very different in these different arrangements, but you have a backpropagation step where you adjust the weights of parameters. So you assign to the different neurons a particular parameter weight. And in all of these machines, you tend to find specialization of particular neurons. They're the detector for, well, in very simple ones, they're a detector for a vertical edge. And that neuron, in an image analysis kind of network, so this neuron or these few neurons sort of specialize on detecting vertical edges, and other ones, detect horizontal edges, and other ones detect color gradients. This is all sort of toy. This is about simpler neural networks than these, billions of neurons kind of ones that are the current ones. So, the image generator, which has the billions of neurons, and it makes things that are in the style of Van Gogh, I think there are some collection of the neurons that really are lighting up much more when you create that production than are most of the others that mostly remain, with little output. They're not the ones that are triggered by that particular specialization. Then whenever, those are particularly lit up during a production, you give the footnote. But the question is, how do you discover that? And here we're really hurt by very large batch sizes. Of course, very large batch sizes are completely required to do this in realistic timeframes. You have a complex neural network. In concept, you could have batch sizes of one sample and do the feed forward and do the back propagation every time you had one sample, not a million samples or even 32. But your machine would be trained 100,000 times slower, and these big ones already take months on thousands of GPUs to train. Well, we don't want to multiply that by 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 in terms of the training time. I don't think the math quite works for the size of batches that current machines use. I mean, what I described, obviously it works for batch size 1. I don't think it works on the 100,000 batch size.
Speaking of the laws in place and the upcoming laws that will be decided by the government and everything, is there, in your opinion, something that one of us, either people using those models or developing them, can do to help, or to help with the progress regarding attribution, copyrights, and moral rights of all this generated content?
I wish I had a better answer to that. I mean, there may be an answer that I have in the future. I've had a conversation with someone who's, I can't disclose more information exactly, but I could potentially be working on exactly this kind of thing if someone I know decides to go forward with funding this, and there's been some coordination with lawyers and lobbyists, and obviously they need technology people to evaluate what, um, if it happens at all, relative to this, to my contact. Um, but it'll probably, whether or not I have any involvement or this person has any involvement in the actual process, I suspect that a lot of people are having similar thoughts. So I think that there probably will be things like, you know, standards bodies, IEEE or IETF, or things along those lines. I don't really know exactly what the relevant one would be. It would probably be something novel. I mean, a new organization, but you'd have to produce technical standards to describe things like the techniques that I've talked about in this conversation. And then, of course, you would have to have lobbyists and lawyers and politicians and things involved, and diplomats for treaty negotiation and things that actually led to the enforcement of these technical requirements. Because I don't think the watermarking is sort of cheap. I mean, like, the computational resources that a private company would have to do the watermarking is negligible. The computational requirements for using any of the kind of techniques for, marking attribution in neuron specialization and stuff is computationally expensive. I mean, maybe prohibitively so that it's just simply implausible to do it, or maybe just expensive, but it's not going to be a negligible cost if this becomes a requirement. So in the latter case of the attribution and moral rights and copyright, I just don't see private companies just doing it on their own. I can only imagine that happening as a result of an actual requirement placed upon them.
But then again, would some people, like bad people, could just try to apply watermark on, like, their own watermark on tons of images or anything else to try to say that they generated them? And, like, would that be an issue that could come up with those watermarking?
For the images, yeah, definitely. I mean, if the images are watermarked in the style that I described, of, you do something like a cryptographic hash to decide which pixels get modified slightly, and then someone else takes the image and does their own cryptographic hash with their own identity and adjusts their set of pixels, then you have two watermarks on it, one of which was, in a sense, authentic, and another of which was not. And distinguishing those technically does seem like it would be very difficult. I think for the text productions, there's really not such an issue. I mean, the only way you can apply a different watermark, applied in the red-green token marking style that I described, is to create an entirely different text. I mean, you come along with, the Louis, token plus Louis and SHA hash of that to get your parody. That's just going to produce entirely different words than anything. I mean, not than anything, but, there's not going to be a whole lot of overlap.
Yes.
And you can't just, in a text production, just randomly change a word in the middle and have it not be obviously wrong, maintaining the quality of the text. So I think it's not an issue for the texts, but it probably is an issue for the images.
Do you see do you foresee any upcoming legal issues or ways we can get in trouble by using such generative models, either through coding or writing images, if we are not careful enough?
Yes, I think that there's going to be lawsuits. In particular, well, there already are lawsuits. I don't know the exact legal status, but there is some particular artist I know in the United States. I think in what's called the U.S. Ninth Circuit. There's 12 circuits for federal level court cases in the United States. They're just like geographic regions of the United States. Anyway, so this particular artist who does sort of covers for like fantasy novels, that's his shtick to do that, and some people who are using the various image generators either describe subject matter that's similar to his and he feels like it looks like his, or they actually say in the style of his name,
Mm.
and it, you know, makes things that look like his pictures, and he wants payment for that. And there's a variety of other people who are visual artists who are in a similar position. So, that'll, my guess is that'll probably be dismissed at some point, that case. I don't think it's probably going to go super far, but you never really know with court decisions. But I'm pretty sure that the same kind of things are going to start happening with the language models as well. And perhaps it'll be dismissed and not go anywhere, but perhaps it'll, you know, go through all kinds of courts.
Would you recommend someone using ChatGPT and Copilot, even though they are maybe lawsuits? Would you suggest someone to use it, to use them?
There's sort of a saying amongst, lawyers that, this is, it's not really a saying, it's a truism that certainly in the United States, anybody can sue anybody for any reason. Um, so nothing you ever do in life is going to be free of the risk of litigation.
Hmm.
That's just sort of the reality. I don't think it's, there's a bit of like anti-slap laws in some United States and in Canada and in other jurisdictions that somewhat limit that. And like in European jurisdictions, they have a little stronger protection for the defendants in uh, malicious litigation. Um, but, in general, anybody can be sued for our normal activity. I don't have to use the generative AI. I can just, write some code today. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in the interest of being restricted. Let's say that you um, wrote this brilliant algorithm and you released it as GPL, which of course is a copyright term and it carries restrictions, namely that the derived works have to have a compatible license. They have to remain free software. Um, so I'm working on this proprietary software and I use your brilliant algorithm. I never use any generative AI. I just, but I read your GitHub repository and I use this and, maybe you're going to sue me. And it really is a improper use. I'm using this GPL code in my proprietary software and I really shouldn't do that. That is genuinely a bad thing. So, I guess it does raise an additional risk because I don't think that, running something through ChatGPT absolves you of your GPL obligations.
So you cannot really say that you didn't know that, in the sense that if you are using Copilot or any other, it won't be the company that is responsible. It will ultimately be you that is using their tool to generate code.
OpenAI has a lot more money than David Mertz does. So if I'm sort of turning around the hypothetical scenario, but if you take this code that, David wrote and whichever way I tell the story, you feel there's, I guess it's the same way, but anyway, there's misappropriation. Oh yeah, that's right. We're still in this scenario. Sorry, cut a little bit of my rambling. Louis wrote the brilliant algorithm. David used it, but did not know that I was using it because I asked Copilot to generate it for me. You could sue me. I'm somehow using it in an improper manner. I don't have that much money. Microsoft and OpenAI have a lot more money. Who is more appealing for you to sue?
Yeah, that makes sense. So an individual like ourselves shouldn't really be scared of the proprietary data of OpenAI. It's mainly, well, of these companies. It's mainly the companies building the assistant, or ultimately the the entity that has the most money, that should be scared of that, and not just users like us.
It seems likely in some sense, but of course, it's litigation is
Yeah.
complicated. You have this alleged misappropriation of your code because it went through the generative AI. Okay, David Mertz doesn't have that much money, but maybe David Mertz works for IBM, and indirectly thereby IBM is the misappropriator. Well, they have a lot of money too. I could look at the whatever the balance sheets of the various companies, but the point is that in all of these cases, there's companies with billions of dollars you could
Yeah.
sue. Um, so as a litigation target, that certainly becomes appealing to choose any one of these. So whether it's Microsoft OpenAI or whether it's David Mertz IBM, I don't currently work for them, but hypothetically I could. Um, there's some deep pockets that your lawsuit is
Mm.
looking for.
Are you ultimately optimistic regarding those generative assistant as well as the legal components that comes with them?
Uh, yeah, I have no idea how any litigation like this is going to turn out. I mean, I'm not optimistic, but I'm not pessimistic either. I'm just curious, really. In terms of their utility, though, I do think that, and this is actually an area where they're getting better and they're often useful now, but they do have to be used with great caution because they'll also produce subtle but terrible mistakes that if you just, don't think about what it did well enough, you get code in production that can cause bad things to happen. Um, so I actually think in education, there should be, I don't mean like primary education, like school kids writing a school paper. I mean, like, computer science degree kind of education. Um, Part of that should include the right attitude towards these code assistants. That yes, they're a useful tool. No, don't take what they suggest as as given as
Yeah.
correct. Um, and obviously that doesn't exist now in computer science classes because it wasn't a question until recently. But hopefully, teachers of programming classes in the future will give advice, perhaps more articulate and more detailed than I just gave, but along these lines to their
Yeah.
students learning to program.
Yes, I usually compare those models with Wikipedia. Basically, what the
Yeah,
teachers told us that you can look on Wikipedia, but you cannot really trust it that it's completely true. You need to confirm with other sources and stuff like that. But so it's, yeah, definitely, to me it's similar to Wikipedia. So yeah, so I will jump in with my last questions. My last question, singular, which is, what are you working on now, and what's your next project or current project? What's your next goal?
well, a couple things. I mean, one, and I don't think this is proprietary to say this. I'm uh, currently doing some consulting, Python code, not particularly ML related, but for just wonderful union, SEIU, Service Employees International Union. I have some personal connections and I'm very supportive of the union and I endorse them. So that's a wonderful thing to be doing. But it's wonderful too that it's consulting because I'm also completing another book for Manning that's going to be called 100 Python Mistakes and How to Avoid Them, which
Oh,
is part
awesome.
of a series that Manning has. But it's enormously fun to write books. And I think I have a distinctive voice when I write them and I have some technical knowledge that is relevant to them. So I'll finish that in a month or two, something like that. Um, since I started the consulting, I slowed down a little on writing, but in the future, listeners, please buy my next book and, and buy my current book.
Yeah, by David Mertz. So exactly, that would, it's definitely relevant. Especially, I think most of the audience are using Python right now, so definitely relevant to try it in about, well, will it be available in 2 months or a bit more than
Oh
that?
no, it'll probably I don't know exactly. It'll probably be written in 2 months, but then it'll probably be another 2 or 3 months or something until you actually can buy it.
Yeah, perfect. So stay tuned for that. And can people follow you anywhere to learn more or just know when it's released?
Oh, I always put stuff on. I know this is. I should have an answer to that. I don't do like Twitter and things like that. But please look at my LinkedIn page. You can. I frequently post things about new publications, new interesting ideas, discussion of
Awesome.
concepts that I've come across.
Awesome. So the link to the existing book will be below, as well as the link to your LinkedIn. And I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. To me, it was really interesting, especially because I learned a lot, and not on the topics that we researchers usually cover. We usually work with the technical details, not the maybe the most relevant details regarding law and ethical concerns and everything about that. So it was super interesting, and thank you very much for your time, David.
Thank you so much, Louis.